Well, hello my friends. My name is Carpo and welcome to another video about a random subject. Today's subject is very detailed, but it is very open-ended, and it's about the expectancy of results and the way that we behave around others and how it affects the outcome of their behavior and their results in life. This extends far beyond kids, but kids are a major priority on this issue. If you tell your children they're going to fail, they will probably fail. If you tell your children that they're intelligent, they will probably act more like intelligent children. If you tell them they have a learning disability, then they will act as if they have a learning disability. The perfect example came to mind as I read somebody talking about how before they had children, they would notice how when kids would fall on the playground, the first thing they do, if they hit their head, is to look at their parents and look for the reaction on their parents' faces. If their parents act all consoling, the kids start crying. And he noted how when he had children, whenever the kids would fall, they would laugh. And then the kids would start laughing, and then they'd run off and play. On a completely mirrored behavior, I do the exact same thing with my kids. I don't laugh at them for getting hurt, but rather I kind of go, oh well, and don't make it a big deal. I don't say, oh, are you okay? Unless obviously they're really hurt. But this has shown how my kid will just rub his head now and just walk off, and that's how they deal with it. And I think that this can be carried into our daily behavior, but I wanted to read some things that I took some screenshots of some various pages that I found really interesting, and this has to do with the observer expectancy effect. So I could sit and talk about it all day, but I better read some actual evidence so you know where I'm coming from. The observer expectancy effect is a form of reactivity in which the researcher's cognitive bias causes them to subconsciously influence the participants of an experiment. Confirmation bias can lead the experimenter interpreting the results incorrectly because of the tendency to look at information that conforms to their hypothesis. Confirmation bias is well known. This is more about science here in this part, but I'll get into the kids thing later. There's some interesting studies that I think are very revealing. It's a significant threat to a study's internal validity and is therefore typically controlled using a double-blind experimental design. Now, a double-blind experiment means obviously the experimenter and the person who's holding the test is not aware of, say, which placebo is being given to each group, because the experimenter himself should never know which group is the control group. And this is very revealing. This means that the emotional cues are picked up by the people. And there's some deep implications for this, but I'll get into that. An example of the observer expectancy effect is demonstrated in music backmasking, in which hidden verbal messages are said to be audible when a recording is played backwards. Some people expect to hear hidden messages when reversing songs, and therefore hear the messages, but to others it sounds like nothing more than random sounds. Often when a song is played backwards, the listener will fail to notice the hidden lyrics until they are explicitly pointed out, after which they are obvious. Now, this is, of course, very common, but we've seen how this is also a selective listening or selective confirmation bias in a way. In research, experimenter bias occurs when the experimenter expectancies regarding study results bias the research outcome. Examples of experimenter bias include conscious or unconscious influences on subject behavior, including creation of demand characteristics that influence subjects. Okay, so I'm trying not to make this too complicated because it's hard to read scientific reports and actually sound, for me anyway, to pick up what the person's saying unless I'm reading it myself. But there's a classical example in here of a guy who had a horse, and he claimed the horse could do arithmetic. And I'll just put this paragraph in a nutshell. He claimed that the horse could count, so he would give the problems to the horse, and the horse would tap out the answers. And they found out it didn't work if the horse couldn't see the person who was giving the answers, or if somebody else was, or if somebody who was asking the questions, the mathematical problems. Turns out that the person who was doing the experiment had a subtle cue that his face, when the horse was done with the final step, the experimenter would relax his face and the horse could pick up on that signal. Therefore, by seeing the experimenter, he knew when he was finished counting to the proper number. And I think that that's something that students also do with teachers, and there's some interesting studies about that in here too. So there's a whole section in here on spiritual healing, and how most of the people who often do spiritual healing have the expectation of results. And the question is whether or not the experimenter or the spiritual healer is actually doing the work, or if the person who's expecting the results is doing the work. So, let's see. It says a randomized clinical trial in healing, published in 2001, investigated the efficacy of spiritual healing, both at a distance and face-to-face, on the treatment of chronic pain in 120 patients. Healers were observed by simulated healers who then mimicked the healer's movements on a control group while silently counting backwards in fives, so they had neutral thoughts. The study found a decrease in pain in all patient groups, but no statistically significant differences between the healing and control groups. So that right there basically says that the effect was from the experimenter. A person who is more prone to think of themselves as a healer is more likely to get the person to believe that they're really being healed, and therefore getting more bias towards believing that they are healing the person. Now, to be clear, I'm definitely not saying that there aren't any healers out there. I'm just saying a lot of people who are claiming to do healing or long-distance healing may very well be affecting the outcomes by the intention of doing so. I'd be curious to see a study where people tried to heal others without the others being aware of them being healed. That would be interesting, and I'm sure there's probably a few. There's a section on double-blind experiments, but it says that, you should randomize the participants and nobody should ever know. So perceptual set is another thing I wanted to mention. Perceptual set theory stresses the idea of perception as an active process involving selection, inference, and interpretation. The concept of perceptual set is important to the active process of perception. It says, perceptual set is a tendency to perceive or notice some aspects of the available sensory data and ignore others. This is also selective confirmation bias or selectivity bias. I think that's no, there's two more here that I wanted to read. Okay. Now Rosenthal, this guy Rosenthal, is one of the foremost experts on, and did a lot of the research back in the day on this particular subject. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. And this is where it gets important too. Rosenthal is well known for his research on experimenter expectancy effects, the influence that a researcher can exert on the outcome of a research investigation. Perhaps the most famous case of an experimenter expectancy effect is the case of Clever Hans, as discussed earlier in class. That was the one with the horse. In one of his early experiments, he tested the effects of experimenter expectancy on maze running performance. He had two groups of students test rats, wrongly informing them either that the rats were specially bred to be maze dull or maze bright. In reality, all the rats were standard lab rats and were randomly assigned to the dull and bright conditions. The results showed that the rats labeled as bright learned mazes more quickly than those labeled as dull. Apparently, the students had unconsciously influenced the performance of their rats, depending on what they had been told. Rosenthal reasoned that similar effect may occur with teachers' expectations of student performance. That says a lot to me. I don't know about you, but the fact that two groups were basically told that your rats are smart, your rats are dumb, and that the outcome of the maze performance was due to the expectations of the actual experimenters. That's, to me, shows a lot. So there's one more here. Rosenthal and Jacobson tested children at Oak School with an IQ test, the test of general ability, at the beginning of each school year, or of the school year. This test was used because teachers were likely to be unfamiliar with it, and because it is primarily nonverbal and not dependent on skills learned in school, like reading and writing. In order to create an expectancy, the teachers were informed that the test was the Harvard test of inflected acquisition, which served as a measure of academic blooming. Therefore, teachers were led to believe that certain students were entering a year of high achievement, and other students were not. In reality, the test had no such predictive validity. 18 teachers at the school were informed that the students in their classes who had obtained scores in the top 20% of this test. These students were ready to realize their potential according to their test scores. What the teachers didn't know is that the students who were placed on these lists were completely at random. There was no difference between these students and other students whose names were not on the lists. At the end of the year, all students were once again tested with the same test, the TOGA. In this way, the change in IQ could be estimated. Differences in the size of the changes for experimental and control group children could serve as an index of expectancy effect. And I'll be darned if I didn't actually get the final page on there from the results. But I guess it becomes irrelevant. I could read articles all day. I already read it earlier, and it basically said that the kids outperformed and improved their scores. There have been stories of students. So there was another study where one teacher was told that your class this year is a very bright class, and that they're on the high end of the spectrum for learning. And other teachers were told that their students were unfortunately not doing well this year, or sorry that you have a bad class. And the kids' results reflected that, how the teachers treated the kids. Now here's one interesting study. They gave children a bunch of candy, single candy with wrappers on each piece. And naturally, by the end of the school day, there were wrappers all over the floor in the school. So rather than tell the kids that they're messy, they made an intention. Over the next week, the teacher would always comment on how tidy the kids were. They say, wow. And then the principal would come into the classroom and say, you guys have the cleanest class in the school. And she did this to all the classes. And the janitor would even come in and write on the blackboards, thank you for, your good job keeping the place clean. At the end of 2 weeks, the kids were again given the same candies, and most of them ended up in the garbage can. And this showed that the expectancy of children to perform in a favorable manner produced the very results. There are some more interesting and kind of offbeat studies, such as some people say that 90% of people in jail, their parents told them you're going to end up in jail growing up. Now, I think that that's a very skewed study, because that also assumes, any parent who's going to tell his kid you're going to go to jail, quite often that's because the kid's already causing problems, or because the parent's maybe a douchebag and he treats his kid bad. Because telling your kid he's going to end up in jail, I think, is a pretty horrible thing to say, but to each his own. They have found that most of the influence on children comes from their environment, of course. So if we want our kids to grow up and respect one another, we have to tell them why. But we don't sit here and say, you're going to end up, you're going to fail, you're going to lose out on this. If you don't go to school, then you're going to end up like this. You're going to end up in the gutter. The kinds of things that we say to one another are affecting the outcome of our society as a whole. So the next time you hear somebody say, well, my opinions are just mine and it shouldn't matter to you any, if their opinions are being projected onto the world, and they're giving opinions of other people that are affecting those people's performance, such as the way that bosses treat their employees sometimes. Some bosses can be real assholes. And it's probably why I have the view on certain subjects that I do, is because of authoritative people in the past who think that they know what they're talking about and everybody else is a doofus. I won't even get into the political comparisons I have here with the current paradigm within our political system, but I look down and not up to people who belittle others. And belittling others, even though a person may stand up for themselves, they may be weak at heart, and they might not be able to defend themselves well, and it may cause a depression. If you tell people that they're going to suffer, if you tell people that they're not doing well, then they're going to reflect that. So let me take a minute to get to really the root of why this is important to me. I feel like society as a whole, knowing this, one of the things that, rather than talking on the individual level of the expectations of a person, a child, a student, now think about our expectations of the world around us. Think about when somebody says, I just know we're going to war, or I just know that this country is going to fail. I just know that the system's going to collapse. Every time somebody says something like this, it reinforces others who also think this way. And it creates a confirmation bias to say, well, so-and-so believes that everything's going to hell, and so-and-so believes it too. Such as the people who say they're taking our guns away, for example. When in fact, if you look at the statistics, there are more guns in this country than there ever were, and handgun sales have been steadily climbing, whereas childhood shootings or children's shootings have been steadily declining. However, we still associate those two together as if the guns are the problem, when it may be the society in general, but we have confirmation bias to what we want to believe. And I definitely shouldn't make any claims about guns, because there's a lot more to it. But my example that came up because I was thinking about how we say that society is violent, and we say that people are violent, and there's all these rapists, there's these murderers, and look at all these terrorists. But when you really look at the big picture, you realize the true confirmation bias is watching the fucking media. and pardon my language, but the media is feeding you all kinds of bullshit about how dangerous the world is, how dangerous people are, how everybody wants to get you. And the truth is, there are a lot of good people out there. There are a lot of people who are living normal lives that they consider normal, whatever that may be, and that want nothing more than to mind their own business, respect their community, their elders, their children, and to get along. But you don't see a lot of news stories on little villages who are doing fine, because there's nothing to talk about. People seek chaos, because when we see chaos, it's something that gets us excited. So my point here is that we need to stop feeding off of negative energy completely. Whether it's telling somebody they're a certain way, or telling people in general that the world's a certain way. Because I've fought back and forth in my mind about whether this world could be a utopia, whether people could pull our heads out of our asses and actually start respecting one another. I don't have any pipe dreams of this utopian land where everybody's happy, because you can never please all the people, and that's the most important thing to realize. It goes back to, I wanted to talk about this in a separate video, but it's like the philosophies of some of the greats, Aristotle, Plato, Kant, and even Nietzsche, Nietzsche had a very grim view. He's the one that said God is dead, but he didn't say it in the way that people think. He was saying that the dogmatic version of God is dead and that people can move forward, because he felt that religion made people, Christianity specifically, he believed that Christianity told people that the meek was the way to be, and that it was okay to be poor, and that you shouldn't yearn for greatness or yearn for this, that pride was bad, that money meant nothing. And in his eyes, this took away the nobility of the human and the ability for us to experience and explore the world. And I can see and understand why he thought that way. Being humble and being poor is fine, but it's not something you should aspire to if it's not what you want. If you choose to be rich, if you choose to have more, that's your choice. But it comes down to a balance between knowledge or information that we have and how we apply it to rein in our primal selves. One man explained it as a chariot being pulled by two horses, and one of them is our spiritual nature, and the other one is our passions or desires to just do what we want. And the driver of the chariot is, of course, our reasoning, rational minds. We use what we know to rein in some of our desires that may be harmful in the long run. If people just went out and raped and pillaged and stole from one another, then society would go nowhere. And this is why we have laws in the society, and this is why it's hard for folks to understand that laws are put in place not to hold us back, but rather to protect the whole, as opposed to a couple or a few who want to have more. Somebody said that no man is free if he lives outside of a community, because that's considered lawlessness. And with lawlessness, that's to do what you will. So the reality is the world we live in is much more complex than we would like to admit. There's a lot more to it than we'd like to admit. And so, since we can't answer these big questions about how do we change this, or, can the world be this way, or what's the future going to be like, we can apply what we know right now to tell our children, you're going to be a great artist, or you're going to be good at this. We got to stop criticizing each other. We stop putting each other down. If you're a teacher, use this and teach your students well by expecting them to do well. And if you are a student, let your teacher know this. If you're a student and you happen to be going to school or college, go tell your teacher this. Say, have you looked up the expectancy results? Because I guarantee these are the little things that we can do in our lives to change the world, to let people know the information we find that's useful. Because not everything can be proven, but there are a lot of things that I think can help us along our way. So I hope that helped somebody to gain a little from it. To me, that was a very insightful thing. This went into marketing and all kinds of other aspects, and I want people to be aware that when people market to you and they tell you, you're going to buy this, or buy this now, or drink Pepsi, all these different things, these are using this very idea of expectancy results. Marketing strategists know this. They've been using it on us since marketing began. And by saying, drink this, or you're going to love this, they're basically saying you've already bought it. And so knowing how this works on us, and knowing how our minds are told what we want and don't want, we can start to control our desires and realize that maybe we don't want some of the things. maybe we don't like Pepsi, you know. But I think that it's important for us to see these things and to understand them a little bit. So talk to y'all later and have a